Why did Maren choose to sit in the absolute dark while her children slept and her bones ached for rest? The world outside her window was a sea of gray mist, yet she remained perfectly still as the clock ticked toward the hour of 4. She was starving for something that food could not provide, a hunger for the sound of her own soul beneath the noise of survival. Every morning for a year, she committed to this ritual of nothingness, a silent protest against the crushing weight of her reality. The memory of her first job always lingered in the scent of harsh chemicals and the cold echo of empty theater halls. Maren spent her nights scrubbing the floors of the Grand Cinema, her hands red from the lie and her heart heavy with the weight of her children's future. As the sun began its ascent, she would transition to the steaming heat of the communal laundry, where the air was thick with soap. Her manager would often bark orders at her, and Maren would nod quietly, saying, "Yes, sir, the linens will be ready by the noon delivery, I promise." By the time the afternoon sun hit its peak, she was already hunched over ledgers at a merchant's stall, tracking crates of spices and grain. This third job paid for the shoes her children grew out of too quickly, but it stole the very breath from her lungs in exchange. One morning, Bren, the local baker, watched her dragging her feet through the cobblestone streets and called out from his shop, "Maren, you look like a ghost walking among the living. Please take this loaf and go home to rest." She forced a smile and replied, "I have miles to go before I can sleep, Bren, but thank you for the kindness." That night, as she tucked her 2 young children into their shared bed, Maren realized that she was vanishing into the margins of her own life. She felt like a candle burning at both ends, melting into a puddle of wax before she could ever cast a meaningful light. She decided then, with a strange and sudden clarity, that she would reclaim 20 minutes of every day for herself, no matter the cost. She set her alarm for 4 in the morning, an hour that belonged neither to her employers nor to her children, but only to the void. The first morning was agony, her body heavy with the leaden weight of exhaustion and her mind begging for the sweet release of slumber. She sat at her kitchen table, the silence ringing in her ears like a physical presence that threatened to swallow her whole in the dark. She did not pray for relief, nor did she plan the chores of the day, for she had promised herself this time was for nothing at all. She simply sat, watching the dust motes dance in the faint light of a dying moon, letting her thoughts drift like fallen leaves on a slow river. Days turned into weeks, and the silence began to feel less like a void and more like a vast, unexplored garden, waiting for a seed. Maren noticed things she had ignored for years, like the way the morning dew clung to the herbs on her windowsill with such delicate persistence. In the second month of her ritual, a strange thought bubbled up from the depths of her quiet mind during the 16th minute of silence. She remembered the irritating rashes the children at the laundry suffered from, and how the expensive soaps were actually the cruelest to the skin. Bren saw her later that day and noticed a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there for many long and weary months. He leaned over his counter and said, "Maren, you look like you've found a secret treasure in the dark." She laughed softly and whispered, "I think I'm finally learning how to listen, Bren." The idea began to take a physical shape in her mind, a recipe for a cleansing wash made from the very herbs that grew wild behind the theater. She spent her 20 minutes not just thinking, but envisioning the process of boiling lavender and soapwort into a gentle, healing foam. She began to gather the plants during her short breaks between jobs, stuffing her canvas tote with the fragrant green stalks of the earth. Her co-workers at the theater mocked her, asking why she was bringing weeds into a place that needed real soap and hard scrubbing. But Maren did not care for their taunts, for the silence of the morning had given her a shield that no insult could pierce. She realized that most people were so busy reacting to the world that they never had time to actually create anything within it. One early morning, the silence yielded its first great fruit as Maren perfected the ratio of oil to ash to herbal infusion. She watched the liquid turn a beautiful, translucent amber in her small copper pot, and she knew she had created something that could change her life. She brought a small bottle to Bren the next day, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of fear and excitement as she spoke. "Bren, please try this on your hands, for I know how the flour and the heat have cracked your skin." He took the bottle with a curious look and said, "Maren, if this works, You've done more than just quiet your mind." A week later, Bren sought her out at the marketplace, his hands looking smoother than they had in over a decade of baking bread. He told her that his regular customers were already asking where they could buy the golden wash that he was using after his shifts. The demand grew like wildfire through the small town, and soon Maren was spending her 20 minutes of silence planning her very first official order. She realized that the ledgers she kept for the merchant had taught her exactly how to manage a business of her own. She began to brew larger batches in the dead of night, her kitchen transforming into a sanctuary of steam and the sweet scent of wild lavender. Her children would wake to the smell of flowers instead of the smell of their mother's exhaustion, and they smiled more than they ever had. One by one, she began to let go of the jobs that had once been her only lifeline, starting with the cold floors of the lonely theater. She felt a surge of terrifying freedom as she handed in her brush, knowing that her own hands were now creating something far more valuable. Then went the laundry, and finally the merchant's stall, until Maren was no longer a servant to 3 masters, but a mistress of her own time. She spent her days teaching other struggling mothers how to gather the herbs and how to reclaim their own moments of precious morning silence. Bren became her partner, using a corner of his bakery to display her bottles, and the shop soon became known as the town's center for healing. He watched her one morning and said with a proud smile, "You've built a kingdom out of 20 minutes of nothing, Maren." She replied softly, "It wasn't nothing, Bren. It was the only time I could hear myself think." Her business was not just about soap, but about the philosophy of the slow path, a movement that encouraged the weary to stop and breathe. She realized that the most productive thing a person in struggle could do was to refuse to be hurried by their own desperation for just a moment. A year had passed since she first sat in the dark, and Maren's kitchen was no longer a place of poverty, but a laboratory of light and purpose. Her children were well-fed and happy, and the dark circles under her eyes had finally begun to fade into the soft glow of her skin. She looked back at the mechanical clock that had once been her taskmaster and realized it had become her most cherished friend in the quiet hours. The 4 a.m. bell was no longer a summons to work, but an invitation to dance with the possibilities of a new and beautiful day. One final morning, as the sun began to crest the horizon, she sat at her table with a cup of herbal tea and felt a deep sense of completion. She whispered to the empty room, "Thank you for the silence, for without the quiet, I never would have found the strength to scream for my life." Her voice was steady and full of a hard-won peace. The story of the woman who woke up early to do nothing spread across the lands, inspiring thousands to find their own 20 minutes of truth. Maren had proven that the loudest breakthroughs often happen in the quietest moments, when we finally stop running and start simply being. As the final light of the story settles, we remember that we are more than the sum of our labors and the weight of our struggles in this world. Maren's legacy was not a business or a bottle, but the reminder that your soul is always waiting for you in the silence of the dawn.